Richmond, Virginia, the 14th of August, 1855. On a Tuesday afternoon, thick with heat, something occurred on the auction platform at Lumpkin's Alley that would fracture the carefully constructed world of Virginia's most powerful families. A young man was brought to the block whose appearance so thoroughly defied every assumption about human bondage that the bidding didn't merely exceed expectations, it stopped entirely. For 17 full minutes, grown men stood paralyzed, unable to form words, unable to process what stood before them. When the silence finally broke, the price would climb to $11,000, more than the auction house itself was worth, more than some entire plantations commanded. The buyer, Harrison Whitmore, would be dead within 3 weeks. His widow would vanish before his body grew cold. And the beautiful slave who caused this catastrophe would trigger a sequence of events so disturbing that Richmond's newspapers would later conspire to erase entire days from their archives, creating gaps in history that remain unexplained to this hour. Before we continue, if you find yourself drawn to these untold stories from history, the ones that refuse to stay buried, do consider subscribing. It genuinely helps us bring more of these hidden truths to light. The truth begins not on the auction block, but 6 weeks earlier in the mountains of Western Virginia, where something happened that no one could adequately explain. Lexington sits in the Shenandoah Valley, a place where old Virginia money retreats to pretend the modern world doesn't exist. In July 1855, a traveling slave trader named Gideon Hale arrived there with a coffle of 12 slaves he'd purchased from failing farms in Kentucky. Hale was known for his cruelty, even amongst men who made their living in human suffering. He worked alone, trusted no partners, and carried a reputation for acquiring slaves through methods that other traders considered too dangerous or too immoral, even by their degraded standards. Hale checked into a boarding house at the edge of town, chained his slaves in the stable, and proceeded to drink himself into a stupor at the local tavern. This was his pattern: buy low in Kentucky, sell high in Richmond, drink away the guilt in between. But that night, something changed. A woman appeared at the tavern. No one could later agree on her description. Some remembered her as elderly, others as middle-aged. Some said she wore black silk, others claimed simple homespun. But everyone remembered her eyes. Grey eyes that seemed to see through flesh to the corruption beneath. She sat down across from Gideon Hale and spoke to him for less than 5 minutes. No one heard what was said. But when she left, Hale sat motionless for nearly an hour, sweat pouring down his face despite the evening cool, his hands shaking so violently he couldn't lift his glass. He stumbled back to his boarding house after midnight. The next morning, the stable where he'd chained his coffle stood empty. All 12 slaves had vanished. Their chains lay on the ground, still locked. No sign of forced entry, no evidence of how they'd escaped. And Gideon Hale was found in his room, conscious but unresponsive, his eyes open but seeing nothing, saliva running down his chin. The town doctor examined him and declared him the victim of some kind of apoplectic fit. His mind was gone. Whatever had happened to him had burned out his ability to speak, to reason, to function as anything more than a breathing body. He was taken to an asylum in Staunton, where he would spend the remaining 4 years of his life sitting in a chair, staring at nothing, occasionally whimpering like a beaten dog. Before we continue with what happened next in Richmond, if you're finding this story as unsettling as it is fascinating, consider subscribing. These suppressed histories need to be brought to light, and your support makes that possible. 3 weeks after Hale's collapse, a slave appeared at the Richmond auction house of Pulliam and Slade. He arrived alone, walking through the front door at mid-morning, his wrists bound by simple rope. No chains, no handler, no documentation of ownership. James Pulliam, the senior partner, later described the moment of his arrival as the strangest experience of his 40-year career in the slave trade. The young man was perhaps 23 years old, tall and lean with skin that held a color somewhere between honey and amber, suggesting mixed ancestry, though not in the usual patterns. His features possessed a symmetry that seemed mathematically impossible. High cheekbones that caught light like sculpture. A jawline that could have been rendered by a master portraitist. Eyes of such an unusual colour, a deep violet blue that appeared almost luminous in certain light, that Pulliam actually stepped backward when the young man looked directly at him. But it wasn't just the physical beauty, though that alone was extraordinary enough to draw attention. It was something else, a quality of stillness about him, a sense that he existed somehow outside the normal flow of time and circumstance. He moved with a grace that suggested noble breeding, yet his clothes were simple labourer's garments, warm but clean. He spoke when spoken to, his voice cultured and precise, yet he offered no explanation for his presence, no story of where he'd come from or who owned him. "Who sent you here?" Pulliam demanded, trying to reassert authority over this deeply unsettling situation. "I was told you would know what to do with me," the young man replied calmly. Told by whom? By the woman in grey? Pulliam felt ice travel down his spine. He'd heard rumours from Lexington. Travellers passing through Richmond had spoken of the strange incident with Gideon Hale and the vanished slaves. The woman no one could clearly describe. And now this beautiful creature stood in his auction house, claiming she'd sent him. "What's your name?" Pulliam asked, his voice barely steady. "My name is Josiah. Do you have papers? Documentation of ownership? A bill of sale?" Josiah smiled, and the expression carried such sadness that Pulliam felt ashamed without understanding why. "No papers, no ownership, nothing but what you see before you. Then you're a runaway. I should hand you over to the authorities." "You could do that, but you won't, because you've already calculated my value, Mr. Pulliam. You've already imagined the price I would bring at auction, and you've already decided that profit outweighs legality." The accuracy of this assessment struck Pulliam like a physical blow. It was exactly what he'd been thinking. A slave of such extraordinary appearance, offered without documentation or traceable ownership, represented an opportunity unlike anything he'd encountered. If he simply entered Josiah into his next auction with manufactured paperwork, who would question it? Who would look past that face and body to ask uncomfortable questions about providence and legality? And so Pulliam made his devil's bargain. He created false documentation claiming Josiah had been sold to him by a Kentucky farmer, forged a bill of sale with a practiced hand, and entered him into the upcoming auction scheduled for August 14th. But word spread anyway. Word always spreads in Richmond when something extraordinary appears. Within days, whispers circulated through the city's elite circles. A slave of impossible beauty. A young man who looked like someone from mythology rather than mundane reality. The Whitmore family heard these whispers at exactly the wrong moment in their declining fortunes. Harrison Whitmore had inherited his father's tobacco plantation 5 years earlier, with grand ambitions of expansion and modernization. Instead, he'd presided over steady decline. Poor crop yields, bad investments in railway stock, mounting debts to Richmond banks. His wife, Catherine, came from old Virginia money, but her family's wealth was tied up in land and reputation rather than liquid capital. The Whitmores maintained appearances through increasingly desperate measures, hosting lavish parties they couldn't afford, purchasing luxuries on credit, always one step ahead of creditors. Harrison's younger brother, Thomas, watched this decline with growing alarm. He understood exactly how close they were to complete financial collapse. And he'd been arguing for months that they needed to sell assets, reduce expenses, admit their limitations before disaster became unavoidable. But Harrison wouldn't listen. Harrison believed in appearances, in the power of reputation to overcome material reality. And when he heard about the extraordinary slave being offered at Pulliam and Slade, he saw opportunity rather than risk. As August 14th approached, James Pulliam realized he'd created something far more dangerous than simple high-value auction. The interest in Josiah had taken on an obsessive quality. Multiple wealthy families had made private inquiries, offers of advance purchase at premium prices, thinly veiled threats about what might happen if they didn't win the bidding. The situation had escalated beyond normal commercial competition into something darker, something that felt like violence waiting for an excuse to manifest. The night before the auction, Josiah requested to speak with Pulliam privately. The auction house owner found him in the holding room, sitting on a simple cot, his hands folded calmly in his lap. In the lamplight, his beauty seemed even more pronounced, almost painful to witness directly. "You know what's going to happen tomorrow," Josiah said quietly. Not a question, a statement. "I know there will be substantial bidding," Pulliam replied carefully. "I expect to see a final price that will satisfy all parties." "That's not what I mean. You know there will be violence. You've felt it building. Men don't spend $11,000 on a slave without rage and desperation driving them. Whatever happens tomorrow will destroy someone, probably multiple people, and you'll bear responsibility for facilitating it." Pulliam felt anger rise in him. "I'm conducting legitimate business. If wealthy men want to compete for valuable property, that's their affair. Didn't you create the circumstances that brought me here?" Josiah's violet eyes fixed on him with unsettling intensity. "You chose to proceed without questioning where I came from. You chose to forge documentation rather than investigate my origins. You chose profit over conscience, Mr. Pulliam. And tomorrow, you'll see where that choice leads." "What are you?" Pulliam whispered, voicing the question that had haunted him for weeks. "You're not like other slaves. You're not like anyone I've ever encountered. What really happened in Lexington with Gideon Howe? Who is the woman in grey?" Josiah smiled that sad smile again. "Some questions answer themselves, Mr. Pulliam. Pay attention tomorrow. Watch what happens when men try to possess what was never meant to be owned. You'll understand everything then." August 14th arrived with oppressive heat and air so thick it felt like breathing water. The auction was scheduled for 2 o'clock. By noon, the Whitmore, Preston, and 3 other wealthy families had assembled at Pulliam and Slade, each accompanied by lawyers and financial agents, each determined to win regardless of cost. Harrison Whitmore arrived with documents showing he'd mortgaged his entire plantation, every acre, every building, every slave he currently owned, all offered as collateral for a loan that would give him the liquid capital to bid without limit. Thomas had refused to attend, making his disgust with this insanity clear. But Catherine accompanied her husband, dressed in her finest silk, ready to witness their family's salvation or destruction. At exactly 2 o'clock, Josiah was brought into the private auction room. And for 17 full minutes, no one spoke. No one moved. They simply stared at him with expressions ranging from awe to hunger to something approaching fear. The reality of his presence exceeded every description they'd heard. He stood on the raised platform in simple clothing, his hands unbound now, his posture relaxed but dignified. And he looked at each bidder in turn with those violet eyes that seemed to see through flesh to the desperations and corruptions beneath. James Pulliam finally broke the silence, his voice strained. "Gentlemen, ladies, we'll begin bidding at $1,000. $5,000, Harrison Whitmore said immediately, his voice tight with need. $7,000, Daniel Preston countered without hesitation. The bidding escalated with terrifying speed. $10,000, $11,000, $12,000. The amounts being thrown out exceeded rational assessment of value. This was no longer commerce. This was something else, something dark and consuming. $15,000, a quiet man named Graves said calmly. "Final offer." The room went silent. $15,000 for a single slave. The amount was obscene. For a brief moment, it seemed the auction would end with Graves as the winner. But Harrison Whitmore wasn't done. His face had gone red, sweat pouring down his temples, his hands shaking. He looked at Catherine, who nodded almost imperceptibly, giving permission for the family's complete destruction. $20,000, Harrison said, in a voice that sounded like it came from somewhere beyond rational thought. The shock in the room was absolute. James Pulliam actually gasped. Daniel Preston made a sound like he'd been struck. Even Josiah, who'd maintained perfect composure, showed the faintest flicker of what might have been pity. "Going once," Pulliam said mechanically. "Going twice?" "Sold," Graves said quietly from the back of the room. "But not to Mr. Whitmore. Sold to death and misery and consequences none of you are prepared to face." "What are you talking about?" Pulliam demanded. "You're not the high bidder." I'm not bidding at all, Mr. Pulliam. I'm simply observing. And what I observe is that this young man was correct. Watch what happens when men try to possess what was never meant to be owned. The lesson is about to begin. If you're still with us at this point, you're exactly the kind of viewer we make these documentaries for. Do consider subscribing. These buried histories deserve to be told. Harrison Whitmore brought Josiah to the family estate that same evening, riding in a closed carriage as if transporting something too precious or too dangerous to expose to public view. The plantation house stood 7 miles outside Richmond, a columned mansion that had represented Whitmore prosperity for 3 generations. Now it represented debt so massive that $20,000 added to existing obligations meant the family owed more than the entire property was worth. Thomas was waiting on the front portico when they arrived. His face held an expression beyond anger, beyond disgust, something closer to grief. "You've destroyed us," Thomas said flatly as Harrison helped Josiah down from the carriage. "For a pretty face, you've traded away 3 generations of family legacy." That first night, strange things began happening. Small things at first. A mirror in the hallway that cracked from corner to corner, despite no impact or temperature change. 3 clocks in different rooms that all stopped at the same moment, 3:17 in the morning. A portrait of Harrison's father that fell from its mounting and landed face down, the canvas torn as if by claws, though no animal had been near it. Catherine tried to speak with Josiah the next morning, finding him in the garden where he'd been given permission to walk. He stood amongst the roses, touching their petals with long fingers, his expression meditative. "Who are you really?" Catherine asked without preamble. "And don't tell me you're just a slave. I've seen slaves my entire life. You're something else." Josiah turned to her with those violet eyes, and Catherine felt her breath catch. "What do you want me to be, Mrs. Whitmore? A victim you can pity? A possession you can display? A judgment you can fear? I want the truth. The truth is you already know. You've known since the moment you agreed to let Harrison purchase me. You understood this would end badly, but you let it happen anyway because you thought maybe, just maybe, my presence would distract from your own secrets. That people would be so focused on the mysterious, beautiful slave that they wouldn't notice what you've been hiding." Catherine's face went pale. "What are you talking about?" "The letters, Mrs. Whitmore. The ones you've been burning in your bedroom fireplace. The correspondence with a certain gentleman in Charleston. Your husband thinks you burn old receipts and meaningless papers. He doesn't realize you've been conducting an affair for the past 2 years. An affair that's produced consequences you're desperately trying to conceal." Catherine stepped backward as if struck. "How could you possibly? I know many things. That's my purpose. Not to be owned, but to reveal. To bring hidden truths into light. Your husband destroyed himself financially to possess me. But what he actually purchased was exposure. For himself. For you. For everyone in this house who's been living behind carefully maintained lies. 3 days after Josiah's arrival, the first death occurred. One of the field slaves, a young man named Isaac, was found in his cabin with his throat cut. The wound was clean and deep, suggesting a sharp blade, and someone who knew what they were doing. But Isaac's cabin door had been locked from the inside. The windows were too small for anyone to enter, and no weapon was found anywhere near the body. The local sheriff investigated perfunctorily. The death of a slave rarely warranted serious attention. He ruled it suicide, despite the impossibility of someone cutting their own throat so deeply and then making the knife vanish. The other slaves knew better. They whispered that Isaac had been talking about Josiah, had been saying things about the beautiful newcomer that suggested he knew something dangerous. Now Isaac was dead, and the message was clear. Some secrets demanded silence. On the 8th day after Josiah's arrival at the Whitmore estate, Harrison began showing signs of mental deterioration. He stopped sleeping, claiming he heard voices whenever he closed his eyes. Voices speaking in languages he didn't understand, but that filled him with inexplicable dread. He stopped eating, saying food tasted like ash in his mouth. His hands developed a tremor that grew steadily worse until he could barely sign his name. That night at exactly 3:17 in the morning, every slave on the Whitmore plantation woke simultaneously from identical nightmares. They dreamed of chains are breaking, of auction blocks crumbling to dust, of a woman in grey walking through Virginia, leaving freedom in her wake. And they heard a voice, impossible to ignore, telling them that liberation was coming, that the system that had ground them down for generations was about to fracture. The sun rose on a plantation transformed. The slaves had gathered near the main house. Not threatening, not aggressive, but present in a way they'd never been before. Present as witnesses to whatever was about to occur. And in Richmond, in auction houses and law offices and bank boardrooms, men were beginning to understand that the acquisition of one impossibly beautiful slave had triggered consequences that would consume them all. The news from the Whitmore estate reached Richmond by mid-morning. Harrison Whitmore was dead, found in his study at dawn, with no marks of violence, no sign of struggle. He'd simply stopped living. His face held an expression that the messenger described as peaceful acceptance mixed with absolute horror, like a man who'd seen the truth of his entire existence and couldn't survive the knowledge. And Josiah had vanished. Sometime between dawn and when the doctor arrived to examine Harrison's body, he'd simply disappeared from the estate. No one saw him leave. James Pulliam read the message 3 times, his hands shaking. Harrison Whitmore had paid $20,000 for a slave who'd destroyed him in 8 days. And now that slave was loose somewhere in Richmond, carrying whatever terrible purpose had killed Gideon Hale and driven Harrison to his death. The manhunt for Josiah began at dawn on August 27th, 11 days after the auction that had set Richmond alight. Professional slave catchers arrived from as far as Georgia and Tennessee, drawn by an unprecedented $5,000 reward. They brought dogs trained to track runaways, brought chains and restraints designed for the most resistant captives, brought a willingness to employ violence that exceeded even the normal brutality of their profession. But they found nothing. Josiah had vanished into Richmond's hidden geography, the spaces between official recognition and actual reality, the network of free black people, sympathetic whites, and enslaved people who maintained secret channels of communication and protection. He moved through the city like smoke, visible for moments before dispersing, always one step ahead of his pursuers. The slave catchers grew increasingly frustrated and increasingly violent. They raided homes in the black sections of Richmond, destroying property and terrorizing families on the flimsiest suspicions. They dragged free black people off the streets, demanding to see their papers, beating those whose documentation wasn't immediately available. The violence they employed in searching for Josiah revealed the cruelty that had always been present in the system, but usually remained hidden behind legal formalities. And that revelation was exactly the point. On September the 3rd, exactly 18 days after the auction, Josiah appeared publicly for the first time since Harrison Whitmore's death. He walked into Judge Pembroke's courtroom during a trial where a captured runaway slave was being prosecuted. Josiah sat in the gallery amongst the spectators and simply watched the proceedings with those violet eyes that seemed to strip away all pretense. The slave on trial, a woman named Sarah who'd escaped from a plantation outside Richmond, stood silently as Pembroke prepared to render judgment. The penalty for her escape would be public whipping and sale to a buyer in the deep south, where escape would be nearly impossible. Pembroke was delivering his sentence when he looked up and saw Josiah sitting in the gallery. The judge stopped mid-sentence. His face went pale. His hands began to shake. Every person in the courtroom turned to look at what had caught his attention and saw the beautiful young man who'd become the object of an obsessive manhunt. The slave catchers who'd been stationed at the courthouse rushed towards Josiah, but he stood calmly and spoke in a voice that carried to every corner of the room. Judge Pembroke, would you like to tell everyone here about the 14 free black people you've declared slaves over the past 5 years? About the bribes you've accepted from slave traders? About your financial stake in the auction house that profits from human trafficking? Pembroke's face turned from pale to red. God, seize that fugitive immediately. But before anyone could reach him, Josiah continued. Or should we discuss what happened to the Thompson family? How you ruled them slaves despite documentation proving their freedom? How they were sold south and you received $200 for facilitating the transaction? The gallery erupted in murmurs. Josiah's accusations were specific enough to ring true. People began looking at Pembroke with new suspicion. He's lying, Pembroke shouted. He's a fugitive slave, making desperate accusations. Then examine your records, Josiah said calmly. Check the cases I've mentioned. You'll find the irregularities. You'll see the pattern. Unless you've destroyed the evidence, which would itself be telling, wouldn't it? The slave catchers reached Josiah, but as they grabbed his arm, something extraordinary happened. The woman in grey appeared at the courtroom door, not entering, just standing at the threshold. And when she raised one hand, every chain in the courtroom shattered simultaneously. The manacles on Sarah, the restraints on two other slaves being held for trial. Even the decorative chain that held a chandelier. All crashed to the floor in a cascade of broken links. The courtroom dissolved into chaos. People screamed and fled. The slave catchers released Josiah and backed away, suddenly terrified of forces they couldn't understand. And in the confusion, Josiah, Sarah, and the other freed slaves walked out of the courtroom with the woman in grey disappearing into Richmond's streets. Behind them, Judge Pembroke collapsed behind his bench, clutching his chest. His authority shattered beyond repair. A quick note here. If this story is revealing something you hadn't encountered before, something that challenges what you thought you knew about this period, then you'll find more narratives like this on our channel. Subscribing genuinely helps us continue this work. Over the next 2 weeks, Richmond experienced what later historians would call the September Crisis, though contemporary accounts would be heavily censored and manipulated. A wave of slave escapes unlike anything seen before. Dozens of enslaved people simply walking away from their owners, moving through the city in broad daylight, somehow evading capture despite massive manhunt efforts. Simultaneously, documents began appearing throughout Richmond, posted on walls, left on church steps, distributed through mysterious channels. These documents detailed the criminal activities of prominent citizens, the illegal slave trafficking, the bribery and corruption, the sexual exploitation of enslaved women, the systematic violence. All of it documented with names, dates, and specific incidents that couldn't be easily dismissed. The economic impact was catastrophic. Slave prices plummeted as buyers became afraid of purchasing property that might simply walk away. Auction houses lost business. Traders found themselves unable to operate. The entire infrastructure of Virginia's slave economy trembled as confidence in the system's stability evaporated. On September 17th, exactly 1 month after the auction, the woman in grey, who had established herself under the false identity of Mrs. Eleanor Graves, orchestrated her final demonstration. She arranged for every piece of documentation she had compiled to be delivered simultaneously to newspapers across Virginia and the North, to federal authorities and to abolitionist organizations. Hundreds of pages detailing Richmond's involvement in illegal slave trading, corruption, and systematic violence. The revelations sent shockwaves through Virginia and beyond. Federal investigations were launched, lawsuits were filed, several prominent Richmond citizens fled to avoid prosecution. The social order that had seemed so permanent and unshakable was revealed as a fragile construction, built on crimes that could no longer be hidden. Judge Pembroke was amongst those who fled, disappearing into the deep south where his crimes would be less scrutinized. His judicial career was destroyed, his reputation obliterated. The other men who'd organized the manhunt for Josiah faced similar fates: bankruptcy, exposure, social exile. They departed Richmond separately over the following days, Eleanor and Josiah heading north, then west, their trail deliberately obscured. The freed slaves they had helped scattering to various destinations. The white allies returning to their normal lives, carrying with them knowledge that would inform their future actions. Thomas Crawford, a former slave catcher who'd witnessed these events, stayed in Richmond, documenting everything that had happened. He compiled his observations into a manuscript he titled The Richmond Horror: How Beauty Became Justice. The manuscript would never be published during his lifetime. Too controversial, too dangerous. It would remain hidden in Crawford's effects until after his death, in 1873, when his daughter would discover it and recognize its historical importance. By that time, the Civil War had come and gone. Slavery had been abolished through constitutional amendment. The system that had seemed so permanent in 1855 had been destroyed by forces far larger than Eleanor and Josiah's operations. But Crawford's manuscript argued that their work had been essential preparation, that the cracks they'd created in slaveholder certainty had made the eventual collapse possible, that truth had been a weapon as powerful as any army. The beautiful slave who sold for $20,000 in Richmond in August 1855 vanished from official historical records after September. No documentation exists of Josiah's later life. No records track Eleanor's movements after she left Virginia. Some historians have suggested they were myths, legends created to give hope to enslaved people during desperate times. But Thomas Crawford's manuscript insists they were real. And more importantly, it argues they weren't unique, that throughout the South, individuals and networks were working to undermine slavery from within, that the system's collapse wasn't simply the result of northern armies and political movements, but also of internal rot, exposed by people willing to risk everything to reveal truth. The auction in Richmond became legend in different ways for different audiences. Amongst Virginia's white elite, it was remembered as a cautionary tale about obsession and excess, about the dangers of paying too much for anything, even human property. The story was sanitized, made safe, turned into a narrative about financial imprudence rather than moral reckoning. But amongst the black community, the story survived in different form, as a tale of resistance and justice, of a beautiful young man who walked into the heart of slavery's infrastructure and destroyed it from within, of chains that broke not just physically, but spiritually, of truth that proved more powerful than any violence slavery could employ. The incredible mystery of the most beautiful male slave ever auctioned in Richmond isn't ultimately about beauty or monetary value or the specific mechanics of one auction. It's about something more fundamental. It's about the price of moral complicity, the cost of participating in evil systems, the reckoning that comes inevitably for those who value profit and status over human dignity. Every person who bid on Josiah revealed something about themselves through their bidding. Every person who participated in his demonstrated the violence they were willing to employ to maintain control over other human beings. And every person who faced the truth he forced upon them had to make a choice: change or be destroyed, adapt or cling to dying certainties. Richmond survived the September crisis, but it was changed. The confidence that had characterized Virginia's slaveholding class was permanently damaged. Questions that had been unthinkable came speakable. Doubts that had been suppressed found expression. And somewhere in the north, a beautiful young man with violet eyes and his determined mother continued their work, moving through cities, identifying targets, using truth as their weapon, breaking chains wherever they found them, creating cracks in slavery's foundation that would widen until the entire edifice collapsed. That's the real mystery. Not how one slave sold for an impossible price, but how resistance persisted even in the darkest times. How hope survived when hope seemed irrational. How people trapped in an evil system found ways to fight back even when fighting seemed futile. The story of Josiah and Eleanor reminds us that history isn't just something that happens to people. It's something people make through their choices. That systems of oppression, no matter how powerful they appear, contain within them the seeds of their own destruction. That truth, once revealed, can never be fully suppressed again. Richmond tried to forget what happened in 1855, tried to erase the records, tried to pretend the September crisis had never occurred. But history remembers. The suppressed documents survive in archives, the stories persist in family histories. The truth endures despite all efforts to bury it. If this story has affected you, if it's made you think differently about history, resistance, and the power of truth, then share it with someone who needs to hear it. These stories are too important to remain sealed away. Subscribe to ensure you never miss our investigations into the histories that powerful institutions try to erase. Because we're only just beginning to uncover the uncomfortable truths that explain how we arrived here. And remember, history isn't merely about understanding the past. It's about recognizing patterns that continue into the present. The same dynamics that allowed slavery to flourish. The willingness to value profit over human dignity. The ability to participate in systemic evil whilst maintaining personal innocence. Those dynamics still exist, still shape our world, still demand reckoning. The beautiful slave who destroyed Richmond's elite in 1855 teaches us that resistance is always possible, that truth is always powerful, that systems of oppression, no matter how entrenched, can be challenged by people willing to risk everything for justice. That's a lesson every generation needs to learn. And it's why we keep excavating these buried histories, keep revealing these suppressed truths, keep breaking open the sealed rooms where uncomfortable stories have been locked away. Until next time, keep questioning, keep searching, keep refusing to let the past stay buried.